You were never meant to hear these stories. Massacres erased from textbooks, secret government plots buried in silence, war crimes disguised as patriotism, and a fascist coup that almost took down the US government. This isn't conspiracy, it's history that was hidden. In this video, we uncover 8 shocking truths they never taught you in school. Not to rewrite history, but to finally tell it right. Because once you know what was buried, you'll never see America the same way again. They built it from nothing. Out of the dust of discrimination, through the storm of segregation, a community of black excellence rose in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Greenwood, they called it. But to the rest of the world, it would become known as Black Wall Street. It wasn't just a name, it was a beacon. In a time when most black Americans were treated as second-class citizens denied fair pay, barred from white institutions, targeted by lynch, Mob's Greenwood was different. It was thriving. It was unapologetically successful. Doctors walked its streets in fine suits. Lawyers owned homes that rivaled the city's elite. Barbershops, grocery stores, cafes, theaters, banks, each one a symbol of what black Americans could build when left to their own devices. People weren't just surviving in Greenwood, they were flourishing. And that very success made them a target. Because nothing enraged the white supremacist status quo more than the sight of black prosperity. The spark that would ignite Greenwood's destruction came on May 30th, 1921. It started in an elevator. A 19-year-old black shoeshiner named Dick Rowland entered the lift in the Drexel building. Inside was a white teenage elevator operator, Sarah Page. What happened next is uncertain. Some say he tripped. Some say he stepped too close. Sarah may have screamed in surprise or pain, but the facts were never clear. By the next day, the local paper painted a much darker picture. Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator. The headline read, "It was all the white mob needed." Whispers turned to shouts. Rumors swirled like smoke. Lynching, justice, revenge. By that evening, a crowd of angry white men surrounded the courthouse where Rowland was held, but something unexpected happened. A group of armed black men, many of them World War I veterans, they weren't going to let another lynching happen on their watch. Tensions grew. The white crowd demanded the black men disarm. The black men refused. A shot rang out, then chaos. Gunfire exploded. People screamed. And in that moment, FEs was lit not just at the courthouse, but across the city. What followed that night and into the next day would be one of the most violent, barbaric, and hidden acts of racial terrorism in American history. White mobs, deputized by local law enforcement, descended on Greenwood with rifles, torches, and even airplanes. Yes, airplanes. Private planes dropped firebombs onto homes and businesses below. Eyewitnesses said bullets rained from the sky. Greenwood was turned into a war zone. Fires lit up the night sky. Entire city blocks vanished in flame. Black families were dragged from their homes, shot in the streets, or forced at gunpoint into detention centers. White men looted shops, took heirlooms, and burned the rest. Women were assaulted, children went missing, elderly men were shot for trying to protect their property. In less than 24 hours, over 35 blocks of Greenwood were reduced to ash. Nearly 10,000 people were made homeless. Estimates say up to 300 black residents were killed, though the exact number may never be known. Bodies were thrown into unmarked graves, into rivers, into silence. The city did nothing. The state did nothing. The federal government looked away. No one was arrested for the massacre. No one was held accountable. Not a single white person. And the newspaper that incited the violence, its front page mysteriously disappeared from the archives. It was an intentional forgetting, a collective amnesia imposed from the top down. The survivors were left with nothing. Their homes gone, their savings destroyed, their businesses, some of which had taken decades to build, turned to rubble overnight. Insurance companies refused to pay a single cent, citing riot clauses to dodge responsibility. It was as if the massacre had never happened at all. Dick Rowland, boy in the elevator, was quietly released. No charges were filed. Sarah Page never testified. The case was dropped. There's a high chance that nothing happened in that elevator at all. A moment of misunderstanding, twisted by the machinery of white supremacy into an excuse for mass murder. For decades, the Tulsa Race Massacre was buried. Survivors were silenced. Schools never taught it. Newspapers never mentioned it. Entire generations grew up in Tulsa, unaware that a racial massacre had ever taken place in their own city. Survivors lived with trauma, with grief, with loss, but no justice. And the children of Greenwood, they grew up without the generational wealth their parents could have passed down. That theft wasn't just financial. It was spiritual, cultural, permanent. It wasn't until the late 1990s that serious efforts began to uncover the truth. Mass graves were searched for. First-hand testimonies were recorded. A city that had tried so hard to forget was forced to remember. In 2021, on the 100th anniversary of the massacre, 3 living survivors, all over 100 years old, they wanted accountability, reparations, recognition, but the shadows of the past are long, and America has always been good at stepping over black pain. Still, the story of Tulsa refuses to stay silent now. Films, books, documentaries, and museum exhibits have begun to restore Greenwood's legacy not just as a place of tragedy, but of triumph. Before the fire, before the blood, Greenwood stood as a defiant symbol of what Black America could be. It's easy to view Tulsa as a horror story from a bygone era, but the forces that destroyed Black Wall Street racism, inequality, the fear of Black autonomy are still alive. They just wear different clothes. The massacre may have ended in 1921, but its consequences still ripple today. We must remember that Tulsa isn't just a Black story. It's not just an Oklahoma story. It is an American story. A story of what happens when hate is empowered and truth is buried. A story of what can be built and what can be burned when a nation chooses denial over justice. The people of Greenwood deserved better. Their descendants still do. The least we can do now is listen, acknowledge, learn, because silence is complicity, and forgetting is the final act of violence. This is what they never taught you in school. But now, 2. The Philippine-American War atrocities. They called it liberation. A noble mission? They said to free the Philippines from the grip of Spanish tyranny and deliver them into the light of democracy. That's what the American public was told in 1898, that their sons were sailing across the Pacific to help, to rescue, to civilize. But what unfolded over the next few years was not liberation, it was not freedom, it was conquest. And it came with a brutality that America has spent over a century trying to forget. The Philippine-American War wasn't even called a war by most U.S. officials at the time. They called it an insurrection, as if the Filipinos had no right to govern themselves, as if they were merely rebellious children needing discipline. In truth, the Philippines had already declared independence from Spain in June 1898, months before the Treaty of Paris was signed in December, in which Spain sold the islands to the United States for $20 million, as if the people living there were livestock, not a sovereign nation. Filipino leader Emilio Aguinaldo had returned from exile to help American forces defeat the Spanish, believing the U.S. would honor its revolutionary ideals. After all, hadn't they themselves fought off an empire? But he was wrong. As American troops took over, it became clear. The Stars and Stripes weren't there to help, they were there to rule. On February 4th, 1899, shots were fired between American and Filipino troops just outside Manila. That moment ignited a brutal 3-year war. A war that would kill more than 200,000 Filipino civilians through combat, disease, starvation, and what would today be called war crimes. The Filipino army, under-equipped but fiercely determined, fought with guerrilla tactics. In response, American forces unleashed an overwhelming wave of terror. Entire villages were burned to the ground. Men were tortured for information. Women and children were rounded up and held in concentration camps, where disease and malnutrition spread like wildfire. In some provinces, orders were given to kill every male over the age of 10. In others, civilians were forced into reconcentration zones, a euphemism for open-air prisons, where survival was a daily gamble. One of the most infamous episodes took place in Samar Island in the central Philippines. After a Filipino ambush killed 48 American soldiers in the town of Baling, U.S. General Jacob Smith issued a chilling command. He ordered his men to turn the island into a howling wilderness. His exact words: kill everyone over 10. Thousands were slaughtered. Villages were flattened. The campaign was so horrific that Smith was later court-martialed not for his cruelty, but because he'd made the mistake of saying the quiet part out loud. American soldiers used the water cure, a precursor to waterboarding, on Filipino prisoners. The technique involved forcing a person to drink gallons of water, then stomping on their stomach to make them talk or vomit. It was torture, plain and simple. But newspapers back home, when they bothered to report it, often framed these acts as regrettable necessities. The Filipino people were described as savages, barbarians. Dehumanization was essential for empire. And yet, resistance persisted. From the mountains to the jungles, Filipino fighters refused to surrender their homeland. They were outgunned, and often betrayed by collaborators or neighbors trying to survive, but they never stopped fighting for their freedom. The United States responded with collective punishment. If one village harbored guerrillas, the entire community was punished, burned, executed. The logic was simple: make the price of resistance unbearable. By 1902, the war was officially declared over. Aguinaldo had been captured, and most organized resistance had been crushed. But sporadic fighting would continue for years. And so would the suffering. American rule over the Philippines would last until after World War II. What began as a promise of liberation ended in occupation, suppression, and decades of colonial dominance. Back home, most Americans had no idea what was really happening. The government tightly controlled the narrative. Reporters were censored or discouraged. Those who tried to expose the truth were marginalized. Soldiers who returned with stories of horror were either ignored or silenced. Only a few brave voices like writer Mark Twain dared to speak out. Twain, once a believer in the American dream, became one of its fiercest critics. He wrote scathing essays condemning U.S. actions in the Philippines, calling it hypocrisy in its ugliest form. "We have gone there to conquer, not to redeem," he said. "And so I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land." The war left deep scars in the Filipino psyche. Generations grew up under foreign rule. Their language, education, even architecture bore the imprint of their colonizers. And yet, the memory of resistance, the spirit of those who fought and died for a free In American textbooks, the Philippine-American War is often a footnote, if mentioned at all. The narrative skips from the Spanish-American War to the annexation, omitting the bloodshed in between. It's convenient to forget. Convenient to frame America's role in the Philippines as one of benevolence, not brutality. But the truth lingers in the bones buried across the archipelago, in the mass graves, in the ruined towns, in the trauma passed down through Filipino families who remember what their ancestors endured. This was not an aberration. It was the blueprint. What America did in the Philippines set the stage for future interventions. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Always the same promise. To spread freedom, always the same pattern. Occupation, resistance, repression, and always the same silence afterward. History is often written by the victors, but victory doesn't erase truth. The Philippine-American War was not a necessary evil. It was a calculated act of imperialism, a betrayal of the very ideals America claimed to uphold. And the victims were not nameless. They were farmers, mothers, children, people who wanted the same thing Americans once fought for: independence, dignity, self-rule. We owe them more than silence. We owe them remembrance. Because only by telling the truth fully, painfully, honestly can we hope to be better than the past we've buried. 3. It sounds like the plot of a spy thriller. Secret government agents, hidden microphones, anonymous letters, sabotage from the inside. Except this wasn't fiction. It wasn't Russia. It wasn't China. It was the United States of America. And the people being targeted weren't foreign enemies. They were American citizens, teachers, activists, veterans, ministers, children. Between 1956 and 1971, the FBI ran a program known as COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, designed to infiltrate, disrupt, discredit, and destroy political organizations that challenged the status quo. Civil rights groups, anti-war activists, black liberation movements, feminists, even artists and students were surveilled, harassed, and manipulated under the veil of national security. But COINTELPRO wasn't about keeping Americans safe. It was about keeping power in place. The program began under FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, a man who viewed dissent as danger and who believed that any movement demanding justice, equality, or freedom was a threat to the American way of life. In Hoover's eyes, the real enemy wasn't foreign, it was domestic. It was people who dared to speak out. One of the FBI's primary targets was Martin Luther King Jr. He wasn't just watched, he was psychologically attacked. The FBI wiretapped his phones, bugged his hotel rooms, and tracked his every move. Agents mailed him anonymous letters laced with threats and blackmail, including one that suggested he should commit suicide before his secrets were exposed. They tried to paint him as a communist, a fraud, a sexual deviant, all in hopes of derailing the civil rights movement by destroying its most visible leader. But King wasn't the only one. Malcolm X was tracked relentlessly, so was Muhammad Ali, Angela Davis, Stokely Carmichael, Medgar Evers, Fred Hampton, John Lennon, Abiy Hoffman. Anyone speaking too loudly, too boldly, too persistently was marked. The Black Panther Party became one of COINTELPRO's most aggressive targets. To the FBI, the Panthers were the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States. But the Panthers weren't terrorists. They were revolutionaries. They ran free breakfast programs for children, provided health clinics in poor neighborhoods, and monitored police brutality long before cell phone cameras existed. Yes, they carried guns, but their true power came from their ideas. That's what made them dangerous. So, COINTELPRO waged war. The FBI infiltrated chapters with undercover agents, sowed distrust with fake letters and rumors, and pitted leaders against each other. They disrupted meetings, manipulated newspapers, spread lies. They turned brother against brother, ally against ally. And in Chicago, they did worse. On December 4, 1969, 21-year-old Fred Hampton, a charismatic Black Panther leader who had united Black, white, and Latino activists into a rainbow coalition, was murdered in his sleep. The FBI, working with local police, provided floor plans of his apartment, planted informants, and participated in a pre-dawn raid that left Hampton and fellow Panther, Mark Clark, dead. Over 90 bullets were fired. Hampton never got to see the sunrise. His partner, Deborah Johnson, was pregnant at the time. Their child was born into a world that had already tried to erase his father. The public was never meant to know about COINTELPRO. It was completely secret, hidden behind closed doors, denied by officials. But in 1971, a small group of activists calling themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI broke into a field office in Media, Pennsylvania. They weren't spies. They were teachers, students, parents, and what they found changed history. Inside the office were thousands of classified documents detailing COINTELPRO's activities, names, targets, tactics, proof that the government had declared war on its own people. The files were leaked to the press. At first, the FBI denied everything. Then they scrambled to contain the fallout, but the truth was out. Congress was forced to investigate. In the mid-1970s, the Church Committee hearings revealed the scale of COINTELPRO and other domestic spying programs. Americans learned that their government had not only surveilled peaceful groups but had actively worked to destroy them. The findings were damning, but justice was elusive. No one went to prison, no one lost their job. COINTELPRO was officially shut down, but the mindset that created it never fully disappeared. Even today, echoes of COINTELPRO still reverberate. Whistleblowers are vilified, activists are smeared, surveillance of black, Muslim, immigrant, and left-wing communities continues often under new names and new laws. After 9/11, the Patriot Act opened the door to even more invasive domestic spying. The tools are more sophisticated now: algorithms, metadata, facial recognition. But what COINTELPRO teaches us is not just about the past. It's a mirror to the present. It shows how quickly a democracy can betray its values, how easily a government can weaponize fear to silence dissent, and how fragile civil liberties become when power is unchecked. The people COINTELPRO tried to crush, King Hampton, Davis, Ali, are now celebrated as heroes, but during their lives, they were hunted, and many were broken. The psychological toll, the fear, the suspicion, it tore movements apart from the inside. That was the strategy. Not just to kill the leaders, but to poison the soil so that nothing could grow again. But the soil still holds seeds, and the truth still matters. Telling this story is a form of resistance. Remembering it is an act of defiance, because if we don't know our history, we are doomed to repeat its darkest chapters. COINTELPRO is real. It happened here, and it was aimed not at enemies but at voices of conscience. Now you know. There's a story hidden in America's history that sounds too outrageous to be real. A secret plot, powerful bankers, top CEOs, corporate giants, and at the center of it, ULA planned to overthrow the President of the United States and replace him with a military dictator. This wasn't a novel. This wasn't Europe. This was America. In 1933. And the plot almost worked. The man they approached to lead this silent coup was no ordinary figure. He was Major General Smedley Butler, one of the most decorated Marines in American history. Two-time Medal of Honor recipient, respected, beloved by soldiers. A war hero in every sense. But what the plotters didn't realize was that Butler's greatest act of patriotism was still ahead of him. To understand the business plot, you have to understand the time. The year was 1933. The Great Depression had crippled the country. Banks had failed. Millions were jobless. Breadlines stretched around corners. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had just taken office, promising sweeping reforms to fix the economy and bring relief to the people. He called it the New Deal, bold, unprecedented expansion of government programs aimed at helping the poor, rebuilding infrastructure, regulating banks, and protecting workers. But to the corporate elite, the bankers and ultra-wealthy who had grown fat off the roaring 20s, Roosevelt was a threat, a traitor to his class. His reforms meant higher taxes, labor rights, government oversight, and they couldn't have that. So, behind closed doors, whispers began. What if Roosevelt could be replaced? Not through elections, but through force. The idea wasn't entirely new. Across the Atlantic, fascism was rising. Mussolini had taken control of Italy. Hitler had just seized power in Germany. Businessmen across the world were watching and taking notes. Strongmen who crushed unions, deregulated business, and restored order were becoming the new model. And in America, a group of powerful men started to wonder, why not us? Among them were alleged figures from J.P. Morgan, DuPont, Goodyear, General Motors, Chase National Bank, and others. Publicly, they denied everything. But documents, letters, and testimonies gathered later would suggest something chilling. These men were ready to finance a coup. They would assemble an army of 500,000 veterans, march on Washington, and force Roosevelt to step aside or install a figurehead president while the real power operated from the shadows. The person they believed could lead that army was Smedley Butler. Butler had retired from the military, but his influence was enormous. He was a man of the troops, known for his plain speech and fierce loyalty to enlisted men. He was seen as incorruptible, exactly the kind of figure who could rally veterans across the country. And so, the plotters sent a go-between, a man named Gerald McGuire, to make contact. McGuire told Butler of a plan to save America from communism, to stop Roosevelt before he could destroy capitalism. He offered money, political power, and even promised Butler would be hailed as a national savior. But Butler listened and said nothing. Instead, he began to quietly gather evidence. For months, he played along, extracting more details. Who was behind it? How would it work? What was the endgame? And then he went public. In November 1934, Butler testified under oath before the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, a congressional body investigating subversive activities. What he revealed shocked the nation. A plot to overthrow the U.S. government, funded by wealthy businessmen, planned in secret and real. The committee found Butler credible. They verified key parts of his story. Maguire had indeed made several trips to Europe, studying fascist movements. Letters and witness statements supported Butler's claims. But here's the strange part. No one was ever prosecuted. The names of most alleged conspirators were buried in sealed testimony. The media downplayed the story. Many Americans never even heard about it. Why? Because the accused were rich. Because they were powerful. Because the idea that America's elite could betray democracy didn't fit the narrative people wanted to believe. The story faded, erased from textbooks, dismissed as conspiracy. But Smedley Butler never backed down. He took to the stage, giving speeches across the country warning Americans of the real enemies, not foreign powers, but the unchecked greed of homegrown corporations. He famously declared, "I was a racketeer for capitalism." He admitted that during his military career. He had helped make the world safe for Wall Street toppling governments, protecting oil interests, invading countries, not for freedom, but for profit. And he had had enough. Butler's courage didn't just expose a plot. It exposed the myth that America's democracy was untouchable, that our institutions were immune to corruption. It proved that given the right moment, economic fear, political uncertainty, social unrest, the pillars of democracy could be shaken by the very people who claim to uphold them. Today, few Americans know the name Smedley Butler. Fewer still know about the business plot. But we should, because the lesson isn't just historical. It's eternal. When wealth concentrates in the hands of the few, when corporations have more power than citizens, when democracy becomes inconvenient for the elite, there will always be those who seek to replace it not with liberty but with control. Smedley Butler chose country over power, truth over silence, democracy over dictatorship, and in doing so, he may have saved the United States from a very different future, one not of ballots but of bullets. This was the moment America stood on the edge of a fascist experiment and stepped back. Now you know.